So picture this, August 3rd, 2016, a cutting-edge Boeing 777, flown by one of the safest airlines on the planet, is making its final approach into Dubai. But what was supposed to be a totally routine touchdown, well, it turned into this terrifying ordeal of failing tech, human error, and an absolutely desperate fight for survival. All right, let's get into it and figure out just what happened here.
Yeah, those words, go around, go around. That was the captain's command. His last chance to pull up and try again, right before everything just completely unraveled. He makes the call to abort the landing, but the plane just doesn't respond.
And that really is the big question, right? How does a landing for an airline this safe end up as a wreck on the runway? As we're going to see, it wasn't just one thing. It was this perfect storm, a catastrophic chain of events that involved the weather, the technology on the plane, and the pilots themselves.
Okay, so to really get how this all went so wrong, we have to start at the beginning, when everything was still completely normal. Let's rewind.
I mean, look at this. Everything about this flight was totally standard. You've got Emirates 521, a routine trip from India to Dubai. The plane is a Boeing 777, basically the workhorse of the skies. Super reliable, super safe. And the airline? Emirates had an incredible record. Since they started in '85, they'd never lost a plane, never had a fatal crash. So for the 300 people on board, there was literally zero reason to think this flight would be anything but completely ordinary.
So, the flight itself might have been routine, but what was waiting for them in Dubai? That was anything but. The crew had no idea, but they were flying straight into a dangerous, invisible trap that was being set by the weather.
Okay, so it was unbelievably hot in Dubai that day. We're talking almost 49 degrees Celsius, that's about 120 Fahrenheit. This crazy heat was cooking up this powerful high-pressure system right over the city. Meanwhile, you've got cooler, low-pressure air coming in from the sea. And when those two meet, well, you've got all the ingredients for a violent clash in the atmosphere.
And that clash of air creates something pilots absolutely dread, especially when they're trying to land. It's called wind shear. Basically, it's a sudden, totally invisible change in wind speed or direction. It can slam a plane downwards or shove it upwards with absolutely no warning, and it gives pilots just seconds to figure out what's happening and react.
So you can just imagine it, right? You've got this superheated air rising up from the city, and it's colliding with the cooler air rolling in from the sea. And where's the battleground for these two invisible forces? It's happening directly over the airport runway. I mean, it's the absolute perfect setup for dangerous wind shear.
And this is where we see the first critical failure in the system. Get this. Just before Flight 521 arrived, two other planes had already encountered this exact wind shear. They both had to abort their landings and perform a go-around. But, and this is the crazy part, neither of them told air traffic control why. And ATC didn't ask. So this absolutely vital piece of information never got to the pilots of Flight 521. They were flying completely blind into a hazard that other people already knew about.
All right, so now we're at the final approach. This is the moment where everything we've just talked about, the crazy weather, that missing information, and even the plane's own systems, all come together. Let's break down exactly how this landing went so horribly wrong, second by second.
So as the plane is coming down, bam, it hits the wind shear. But that's not all. The runway itself is scorching, a blistering 68 degrees Celsius, and it's radiating hot air, thermals, that are pushing up on the plane from below. So you've got this 1-2 punch that basically makes the huge jet float way too far down the runway, completely overshooting the spot where it's supposed to touch down.
Okay, to get what happens next, we need to talk about one specific piece of tech, the TO/GA switch. TO/GA stands for takeoff/go-around. It's basically the pilot's get me out of here button for an aborted landing. You hit it, and the plane's computers are supposed to jam the engines to full power and start climbing. Simple, right? Well, not quite. It has this kind of hidden rule built in. The second the landing gear feels the weight of the plane on the runway, that TO/GA switch turns off. It's a safety feature, so you don't accidentally take off again once you're already on the ground.
And that right there is the key to this whole disaster. Here's the sequence. The pilots realize they're floating too far, so they decide to go around. The captain hits the TO/GA switch. But in the exact same instant, the wheels just barely kiss the runway for a split second. That's enough. The TO/GA system is now disabled, just like it's designed to do. So the captain has pressed the button, but nothing happens. The engines just stay at idle. But here's the thing, nobody in the cockpit realizes this. The first officer, thinking they're climbing with full power, even calls out positive climb. The captain then retracts the landing gear. And just like that, they're in the air with no power and no wheels. They've essentially become a giant 200-ton glider.
With its engines still quiet and the gear coming up, the plane's momentum carried it upwards, but only to a maximum height of 85 feet. That's it. From that point, with no thrust to fight gravity, there was only one way to go: back down.
You can only imagine the shock in the cockpit. A don't sink alarm starts screaming at them. The captain realizes what's happening and shoves the throttles all the way forward by hand, but it's just too late. It takes time for those massive engines to spool up to full power, and it was time they just didn't have.
The huge Boeing 777 just slammed back down onto the runway. With no landing gear, it skidded for 800 meters. That's nearly half a mile, grinding along on its belly and its engines. Parts are flying everywhere, sparks are igniting fires, until it finally spins to a halt in this massive cloud of smoke.
And then comes the call to air traffic control. Mayday, 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 evacuating. The crash itself might have been over, but for everyone on board, the battle for survival was just getting started.
Inside that cabin, you can imagine the stunned silence just turning into pure panic. A fire had broken out on the right side of the plane, and everyone knew the clock was ticking.
But this evacuation was chaos. It took a full minute for the crew in the cockpit just to find the checklist they needed. And then you had passengers actually trying to grab their luggage, clogging up the aisles and slowing everything down. It took a dangerously long 7 minutes to get everyone off. And just 2 minutes after the last person escaped, the right wing's fuel tank exploded in an enormous fireball.
And to make a terrible situation even worse, get this, 7 out of the 10 emergency exits on the plane couldn't even be used. They were either blocked by fire, the slides were torn away by the wind, or they just plain failed to deploy. That meant all 300 people had to funnel out of just 3 working exits. It's unbelievable.
And yet, somehow, against all odds, every single person on that plane, all 300 passengers and crew, got out alive. It was an absolute miracle. But that miracle was followed by tragedy. A firefighter, Jassim Issa Muhammad Hassan, was on the ground fighting the blaze when the wing exploded. He was killed instantly.
So of course, the big investigation that followed had one main question. How on earth did this happen? And what they found was that it wasn't one single mistake or one single failure. It was a deadly chain reaction, a perfect alignment of things going wrong.
Let's just quickly walk through that chain. First, you have the weather. If the pilots had just been told about the wind shear, they would have handled the go-around completely differently. Next, the technology. The investigation revealed that the pilots didn't fully understand that quirky rule about the TO/GA switch turning off, and it turns out a lot of other pilots didn't either. It was a huge blind spot in their training. And finally, the human element. The crew was so used to the plane's automation doing its job that they skipped a fundamental check, actually looking at their instruments to confirm the engines were powering up. It's a classic case of over-reliance on the machine.
Ultimately, the story of Emirates 521 is just a powerful, stark reminder of something really important. As our technology gets more and more complex, more automated, this dangerous gap can open up between what the machine is actually doing and what the human thinks it's doing. And it leaves us with this really critical question, not just for aviation, but for everything. When it all comes down to it, who's really in control? Is it the person or is it the program?